Something has been leaving strange meat in our fridge. I know that sounds weird. It is. And I say something instead of someone, because I don't think it's a person doing it. Look, my wife Maria and I moved into this house on 413 Rutherford Lane about a year ago. We got it for a steal, and at the time, I didn't question it. My wife was pregnant when we found the place, and with our budget, a 4-bedroom, 3.5 bath in a nice neighborhood was a godsend. I found out after the fact that a couple had lived there previously, and apparently, their son had gone missing. The father had broken his neck trying to open a door on the second floor from the outside, and the mother wanted to get as far away as possible. Well, that's what our neighbor Stephen told me anyway. Though, honestly, I doubt it would have changed our decision to buy. There's no door on the outside of the house on the second floor, by the way, so maybe Stephen had something confused. Anyway, the house is old, 1804, I think, and it still has a servant's kitchen in the basement. At some point, a previous owner had renovated and put a new kitchen in on the ground floor. But some of the servant's kitchen is still there. A few cabinets, a non-working sink, a cast iron wood-burning stove, and a refrigerator. Obviously the fridge isn't original. I don't know if the rest of it is either. But the stove at least looks like it belongs. The fridge is one of those 1950s fridges. Seafoam green with chrome accents and a handle that sticks sometimes. It's the kind of fridge I imagine a kid might get stuck in while playing hide and seek in a scary movie. Well, immediately a few things seemed off about that fridge. For one, as best I can tell, it's bolted to the floor. It looks heavy, sure, but I'm not exactly a small guy, and I couldn't budge it. Not an inch. The fridge works. I mean, it's cold inside like a fridge should be. But for the life of me, I can't see where it might be plugged in. None of these quirks deterred me from using it, of course. And to be honest, I didn't think about it much. Until the meat. Like I said, there's a proper kitchen on the first floor. And so the basement fridge became a repository for extras. Beer, wine, some produce if we overbought. Then, about a month into living there, I found our first package. It was sitting on the top shelf, a pristine brown paper parcel with a single piece of white tape holding it closed. It was innocuous enough, but my wife wasn't usually the one who stocked the fridge, so it piqued my curiosity. I still have a very vivid memory of picking it up, because I was at once disgusted and curious. The moment I touched it, the paper became wet, a dark, greasy splotch spreading across its surface. By the time I actually got it out of the fridge and set it on a table, it was dripping. The paper was almost completely soaked. That piece of tape was barely hanging on, curling away from the sodden paper, as if willing me to give it that last little nudge and reveal the contents. I did, and as I opened it, I saw a loose pile of meat, haphazard cuts of sinewy flesh in deep reds and browns with an oily iridescent sheen. The smell wasn't what I would have expected. The meat oozed with deep red blood and it smelled metallic. I know that blood has iron in it. I've sucked a paper cut before and gotten that metallic tang. But this smelled metallic, like metal filings almost. I put it in a bowl and back in the fridge as quickly as I could, but when I asked my wife about it, her response was, "What meat?" I certainly didn't put it there, but if she didn't either, well, we were the only ones in our house. I should have been more concerned in that moment. I see that now, but at the time, I rationalized. The meat must have been there before we moved in. I must have missed it somehow in an otherwise empty fridge. It didn't make sense, but the notion of someone sneaking into a house to leave meat in a basement kitchen was so far-fetched that it didn't occur to me. When I returned to the fridge barely 3 hours after first finding the package, I was in for another surprise. The bowl I had put the meat in no longer contained chunks, but rather a viscous, lumpy sludge. It was almost as though the meat had melted, and in my revulsion at the bloody slurry, I could have sworn that it shivered. I threw it out along with the bowl. I ended up throwing out the beer and wine too. I couldn't explain it, but everything else in that fridge had somehow taken on a raw, gamey flavor. And after I drank, my lips would end up with a distinctive film of something like cooked fat. That was that. I wouldn't use the fridge for a while, and as it happened, an unexpected bout of morning sickness in my wife distracted me enough that the meat in the fridge passed out of my mind. For a while. Maria's morning sickness turned into an edgy, emotional minefield, and while I tried to be sympathetic, the thing she seemed to desire most was space. I relocated my home office to the basement so I could give it to her during the day, at least. But being down there, I began to remember the fridge again. It was perhaps a month after the first package that I opened the fridge, and what I found inside wasn't another package, but 3 others. That sight would have made me uneasy enough. But while 2 of them were untouched and still held with identical strips of white tape, the third was open. I stared at it, utterly repulsed by what I saw. The meat was a mottled gray, with patches of mustardy yellow foam that bubbled up from puckered recesses in its surface and beneath it. On the paper writhed a blanket of pale white maggots. I threw all 3 of the packages away and scrubbed that fridge for the better part of an hour. I scrubbed, but I couldn't clean away what struck me as one of the most disturbing aspects of that foul lump of meat. There was a thick bone protruding from it, and on its surface, I saw what looked like the scrapes and indentations of human teeth. With that, the scenario finally sunk in and began to twist into horrific possibilities in my mind. Someone was coming into our house and leaving meat in our fridge. No, storing meat in our fridge. And whatever that meat came from, that someone was eating it. It didn't take long before I began to consider the possibility that whomever it was, they might not be leaving right away.
Maria!
I shouted as I ran up the stairs.
Marie!
What is it, honey? She answered from the living room sofa, a picture of serenity compared to my sudden mania. She looked so peaceful, even as she wrinkled her forehead at my distress. I wanted to tell her, to warn her, but she was so tightly wound, even when she didn't look it. The doctor had told her to avoid stress, and telling her about a stranger sneaking into our house wouldn't help at all. I decided to lie. With the baby coming, I'm just worried. I just want us all to be as safe as possible. All right, Maria? All right. Maria said that changing the locks was a lot of worry over nothing. But eventually she relented. She didn't have to know about my nighttime sweeps of the house, checking windows and cupboards and closets. She didn't have to know anything. But something about the next couple of weeks told me that she did. She started sweating in her sleep, mumbling to herself as she was drifting off. I must have checked the fridge a half-dozen times a day for a while. But even as I saw nothing there and hid my protective efforts, I could see that something was getting to her. Perhaps she could read it on my face. Perhaps she just felt the ominous air that followed my efforts. I thought a lot of things, but never the right thing. I had considered talking to her about it and even tried a few times. but she would get irritated a few words into the conversation. A few words more and she would turn to shouting or crying, saying that I didn't care about her, that I never loved her, and that I had no idea what she was going through. She was wrong about most of it, but not about the last bit. I could read a dozen pregnancy blogs and books, but ultimately I wouldn't understand her struggle. Her belly swelled with a child that would change everything about our lives. Maria was just changing with it. I wasn't helping things with my increasing paranoia. The doors were locked, the windows too. I bought alarms, and after my third sweep of every inch of the house and a dozen other redundant precautions, I knew that whomever had been in our house was gone. Finally, I decided to just be there for her. I reasoned that the best way to protect her was by ensuring that I was present, not by endlessly checking to see that someone else was absent. I moved my home office back upstairs and left the basement alone. I gave her space when she wanted it, and I was there when she wanted me. She seemed happier. We were safe. We were safe. We were safe. I had reassured myself of the comforting notion so many times that I almost believed it. All logic and reason told me that we were. But we weren't. In the coming months, Maria seemed perpetually on the brink of fatigue. But she seemed better, warmer, less agitated. We joked, laughed, and mused about what our son would be like. I even began to forget about our unseen guest and our basement deliveries. Although habit still drew my eye to every lock and window before we would turn in each night. We were safe. I awoke to the sound of screaming in the middle of the night, a week before Maria's due date. She wasn't in bed.
Maria!
I followed the sound of her agonizing shrieks as I bounded down the stairs. But as I reached the first floor, her screams stopped as abruptly as they had begun. Where was she? I flung myself around corners, through doorways, and into rooms, searching, desperate. My calls of her name were met with silence, a silence that I filled with a hectic jumble of horrible possibilities. The baby, a stranger.
Maria!
She wasn't there. Basement. I skipped steps as I bolted into the darkness. I wish I hadn't turned on the light. She was there, in the old kitchen, her body lying on the floor. My knees buckled, cold sweat beating on my skin as I stared in sickened disbelief. She was lying next to the fridge, but only the top half of her. The way everything stretched told me where the rest of her must have been. Her legs, her belly, our child. The fridge. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in the sight of my mangled wife and her face that seemed frozen in a silent scream. I left. I slumped onto the sofa in the living room, and some unknowable time later, I remembered something. My paranoia, my precautions, my attempt to make us safe. I had installed a motion-activated camera in the basement, pointed right at the fridge. I had just never checked it. When I opened my laptop, I knew where I had to stop, where my stomach would make me stop. I couldn't watch those last moments, but I had to know something about what had happened. What I found on those recordings were unexpected. I had been avoiding the basement, but every night for weeks, there were recordings. All of them time-stamped at exactly 4:13 a.m. It was Maria. She would wander into the basement, walk the same path to the refrigerator door, open it, and pull out a package. All the videos were the same. Maria stood at the table and tore into chunks of that disgusting meat until it was finished, and then she would neatly fold the paper and place it back in the fridge. She must have cleaned up elsewhere, because in every video her hands and mouth were dark with blood when she finished. I stopped watching the entire videos after the first few. The sight of her gorging herself on that meat was too nauseating to repeat. Still, there was one thing I noticed in the way she moved. Her arms were always limp as she walked, and she seemed to stare off as she ate. I'm not certain, but I hope, she was sleepwalking. I sat for a while with my cursor hovering over the final video, but I clicked eventually. It started the same as the rest. She took out the package, she ate, but instead of folding the paper afterwards, she laid in on the ground in front of the fridge and took off her shorts. As I watched, a voice in the back of my mind screamed for me to turn off the video, but my hand wouldn't listen. I watched her give birth on that floor, but what came out of her was horrid and deformed. All of its eyes blinking out of sync as its arms and legs twisted and bent at inhuman places. I was paralyzed watching what should have been my son latch its mouth onto Maria's leg. And then I saw a long hand emerge from the fridge to claim it. The video cut to static as Maria roused from what I assumed to be sleep and started to scream. I think I'm glad for that. I don't think I could bear to watch her end, and I don't know if I could have stopped myself. The meat, I don't know what it is, but I know what it did to Maria. The night sweats, the agitation, and the fighting, I thought it was all part of the pregnancy, of her receptiveness to my paranoia. But she got that way when I was checking that fridge constantly. I think whatever brought that meat to her didn't like being looked for. And I think that what Maria was experiencing was withdrawal. That fridge fed her for months, and in the end, whatever is inside of it felt owed. Whatever the truth is, I am doing everything I can to avoid knowing it. I should have called the police. I should have tried to recover what remained of the woman I loved. I should have, but I cannot cope with what is at the bottom of those stairs. So, instead I wrote, hoping that madness committed to paper will leave my mind alone. Still, I know she's there. She's been there so long.